I would think around between 5 and 10 minutes.
I did my practice on the slideshow that I already made, or am I making a new slideshow on a different topic?
No, the one that you sent me, the topic. Yeah, that one's good. Yeah. You're welcome.
So for the rest of the class, is it just brainstorming what we're gonna do for that?
No, let's take another minute or so and then we'll see see where we are. We're gonna talk about Russia and the Russian Federation. Any other questions? All right, so what do we think? Do we need to continue the way we had planned with an outside activity next week and you work on your projects, or do we want to do the Zoom? Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say possibly work on our projects because it seems like a lot of us haven't necessarily started.
That's fine. So then, okay, instead of we're gonna nix this idea and we'll keep it the way it was. So next week we have it scheduled for out of class research project. Instead, we're going to just work on our group projects and individual projects for some of you. Yes.
So if mine's already done, am I allowed to just not?
Yes. You get some free time. Yes.
So it is not going to be a research assignment on, but it's also going to be in class instead of out of class.
Next week?
I mean, that March 25th.
Yeah, so for March 25th, we won't come to class at all. You guys will work at home, but work on your group projects that are due on April the 8th.
Okay, so that research assignment is just organized out here.
Yeah, we're gonna not count that one. So there won't be anything to submit next week. You will but I'll be available. So if like you want to talk to me, if you need help with your projects or anything, I will be available if you need to let me know when we can meet via Zoom or whatever. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and if you make sure you have each other's numbers and that you have contact info and everything so that you won't be like, oh wait, I needed to find out what we were going to do. Oh, what did you come up with? Oh, that could be very interesting.
I'm gonna try to get on most of the highlights.
Okay.
Economic, political, language, action.
Mm-hmm.
That's the part that got me. But we're good with it.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, you could go a lot of ways with that too. That would be very interesting. The influence of jewelry on culture just is a huge a huge topic. So
Is there In terms of geography, we have to talk about the whole world or the region or the country or.
It's up to you. If you, it would be very time consuming to do like a global overview. I would pick something more specific, if it was me. Oh, yeah.
You can see how.
Mm-hmm.
But by when, groups have to tell you what our topic is.
Try to let me know in the next, if you can, let me know in the next day or so. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Okay. Well, then let's go ahead and let's start talking about Russia. Because this is Russia is going to be a very unique region because it has a long history, but it also has a history that is very unique. And we're going to spend a little more time talking about the historical impacts, or I'm not going to go through all of Russian history because that would take us forever. But we are going to talk just, about some of the general things that have happened throughout Russian history because it has affected how they have developed. And how it is still impacting the country today and all of those other countries that are now newly independent states. So when we're thinking about Russia, it's not just Russia, but it is also the countries that surround and border Russia, and that are along the border of Eastern Europe. And I said we would talk more about Eastern Europe because this week, because we've seen a lot of impact and a lot of association with Eastern European countries and how they have been at times controlled and dominated by the Russian Republic. So when we're looking at the physical geography, it is we can see that just the size alone can create a lot of problems. It can also have a lot of impact in terms of the economy and how different cultures have developed within this large territory. We have 12 former republics that made up the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And that was, now those countries have acquired independence. And we're going to look at that as we go through. And then if we think about all of the cultures that are within the borders, we might see something very similar to what we looked at in sub-Saharan Africa, where we have many, many different cultural groups. There's more than 30 different ethnic internal republics, and each of those with different identities, different, different cultures, different languages, and different barriers in terms of a unified state. The diversity, though, is a lot of times hidden because the focus does get put on Russia, and the focus does get put on, it's either you're talking about the time of the Soviet rule, or we're talking about Russia and their modern politics, So the diversity can sometimes get hidden because of that control, or that combining all of these into one. Why is this not moving? Okay. If we are, and we won't spend a whole lot of time on the physical geography, but just very briefly, some of the important things to note. This is very complex in terms of the landforms that we see. If we start out over here, the North European plain, you're going to see that is the most densely populated. That's where we're going to find the majority of the people living. It is where we have, access to fertile soils, we have access to water, we have access to lots of the important things that you need for people to live. And that's where we saw the rise of some of the early city states. And it remains today the most densely populated area in the region. And then we have the Volga River, which is important because of trade. We have the Ural Mountains, which really, I'm sorry, this map is very small, but if we see the Ural Mountains really form kind of a boundary. So when we think about this area, everything to the west, we can kind of attribute more with, think about the cultures of Eastern Europe, but then everything to the east, we're going to find has a different culture. And then everything to the south, we're also going to find that has a different culture as well. But the Ural Mountains, they're not really a barrier to movement of people. They're still, where I think they're like 30 million years old, so they're still relatively young, but they don't really serve as a barrier for people and the movement. And then we have the Caspian Depression, and that is, if we take a look, this is a very fertile area, and it also has access to the Caspian Sea, which is another really important place in terms of population and historical groups of people, because it was easy to to trade and to have access to movement. And then we have the Western Siberian Plain, which is the largest plain in the world. And it has a lot of oil reserves. So one of the things that we'll find out about, especially when we're looking at the taiga area in Russia, and the tundra in the northeastern part, is we have a lot of natural resources. It's very rich. It's very, we find a lot of reserves that would be very beneficial, except that the tundra and the taiga are not very conducive to extracting those resources. So while they do have a lot of resources, they are not readily available. It takes a long time to get from one area, from one place to another. We find a lot of frozen soils, so it takes a lot of effort to dig down and to get to those resources. And then just the effort that it takes to bring those back to a port where they can then use those for trade purposes or get those to the rest of the people. So a large area with a lot of resources, but not a lot of means to get those resources to the people or to use those for their own benefit. To the south, we have also a whole nother area of the region, which we could talk about as a specific group in itself. Largely, the Caucasus the culture is more similar to that of Eastern Europe. However, the language and the ethnicities are largely tied back to the early Rus ethnic groups. So not really too much that we have to remember in terms of the physical geography, just that this is a very complex region. One of the things that makes this difficult is that frozen area. Where when we looked at other places that had a large complex territory or physical geography like sub-Saharan Africa, this one is different because it's largely frozen the farther north you go. And so that really kind of dictates how they how the cultures have over time, how they've lived, how they have conducted their economic activity, and those kinds of things. There is the Pacific Mountain Zone. We do see that this is along the Ring of Fire. So if we were to see a picture of the whole map, we could see how it is connected to the rest of the Ring of Fire. There's one over here. Not a great, because it's always in a bad place. You know, Russia is very close to Alaska. And then when we talked about this area, it was along the Ring of Fire. And so Russia does have area of volcanic activity, which has contributed to some of their very fertile soils. And that's moderated by that warm ocean current. They have also some of the deepest trenches because of those diverging plates. So we do see some of the deepest waters. Lake Baikal is one of those because of the diverging tectonic plates. They create very deep trenches, and that's where we see Lake Baikal becoming, I think that's here. It's hard to see with this map, I apologize. Where we have a lot of the, it's important to trade and also for irrigation for agriculture in this region. There is a long history of harsh continental climate. You have a long cold winters. The summers are very short, which contributes to the physical land not thawing out and creating some of that issue. The best soils are found in the Southwest. And we see that in those plains areas, we have a lot of agriculture. And that's where you get, you know, the land that's not as frozen, and you get a lot of precipitation that contributes to some pretty fertile agriculture. So we're going to take, I don't typically like to put a lot of text on a slide, but because the history is very, very lengthy, I just put important, you know, very important movements and important times of change throughout history. So if we go all the way back to there's different theories on how the first people ended up in Russia. And so there's the theory that they were, a newer theory that they were Slavs. But then there is this other theory that's even older that says that it were, that it was another group of people. The consensus among historians, it depends on what historians you listen to, but the most of the consensus is that was the Kievan Rus were originally from those East Slavic tribes that migrated down. Some thought that they were Vikings, but that theory is not as plausible to some historians because of the culture and how it developed over time. There was some question as to if that culture was more closely aligned to Viking culture than Slavic tribes. So we geographers typically go with the Eastern Slavic tribe theories. So as they migrated down into Moscow, then we see this culture developing there. And this Kievan Rus population, they became a very popular and powerful nation state. They were very well known for their cultural achievements from a very early part of history. They chose to adopt Christianity over Islam, and because of the restrictions in Islam on alcohol, and they chose to go with Christianity. There's like a whole discussion on that if you're interested in listening to history podcasts. But they did go with Christianity, and that has kind of dominated and ruled over the years, and had a big impact in the way that things have played out. It had a huge impact up until the Soviet times. Christianity was a large part of the culture, and it influenced how these, the social structures developed over time. In 1054, the Kievan Rus began to split apart into these smaller groups, and then it weakened that central authority. So what was originally a strong power began to weaken over time, and then that's where we start to see sort of a disjointed and a difficult history where there is a struggle for the power. And then we see major revolutions and major changes in those power groups over time. In 1240, the Mongols invaded the Kievan Rus, and they were able to subjugate those Russian territories, and they put them under the Mongol Empire's rule. And then during the Mongol rule, they did find a little bit of political unity, and they were able to, as they were paying these tributes to the Mongols, they were able to see their economic, development, because as long as they were paying tributes, there was a time of peace somewhat. It was an expensive time of peace, but they were able to thrive and to function and to trade, and that began to build up their economy. It also allowed them to expand their cultural elements. And so they began to, as they began to trade, the different elements of culture began to be exchanged as well. And then that allowed more people to move into the area around what is now modern day Moscow. And it began to really thrive and become that popular destination for the people. So, but then moving forward in time, there was this, during that fragmentation of those Kievan Rus, we began to see other powers come in. The Ivans, there's a long history of the Ivans and their rule throughout this history, because Moscow had this very strategic location. It was close to the water, it was close to the resources that people need. And it began to expand. And then we're not going to talk too much about the czars, other than over time they developed this system of the czar. They overthrew the Mongol the Mongol rule, and they were able to establish their own czarist empires. And so those czars began to rule and began to change. There were it was Ivan the Third was the Ivan the Great, and then ruled for a long period of time where they had access to trade and wealth, and we began to see the economy grow under Ivan the Third. And then we saw Ivan the Fourth come into power. Ivan the Fourth was known as Ivan the Terrible, and he began to try and expand the territory. So we began to see this push for conquering and expanding the territory. We also began to see a lot of people begin to find dissatisfaction, and we began to see a lot of the different cultures starting to have conflict. And so that led to a whole lot of instability, and kind of began us into this period where we see constant turmoil and constant difficulty for the economy as well as the political system. The Romanov dynasty came into power. They ruled Russia for a long period of time until the revolution of 1917. So like we've skipped a whole lot of information here, but trying to move forward to 1917, this is when we saw a really huge expansion of the Roman Empire. I'm sorry, the Russian Empire. So with one of the things that happens with a territory this large, and some of the issues that these leaders were facing, was how do you efficiently get your population to to embrace innovation and technology and modernization. There had been several attempts at trying to bring modernization to the people. But however, because of this constant ruling class, it created somewhat of a feudal system. Think about when we looked at Europe's feudal system and how it forced people into a largely agrarian society. We see the same thing happening in Russia with that, because of that turmoil and because of those constant changes and social hierarchy. It led to a time similar to a feudal system that we saw last week. A lot of the people in a feudal system end up living in poverty because there's no social mobility. There's no means for them to move up in their social class. And so we see this autocratic rule from the czars, and all the way through even today. We could still see elements of this autocratic rule. So a lot of people were discontent. There were a lot of people who were trying to move to where the city centers where a lot of activity and innovation was happening. It was difficult for them to do that. So a lot of people stayed largely rural. However, those city population centers began to increase. They began to build up. And then we see, if we were to look outside the boundaries of just Russia and those states around Russia, we would see places like Poland and others that are expelling groups of people and these diasporas of people moving into the region as well. And then that leads to even more contesting of these multi-complex ethnic groups that are coming in into the area. So we move forward through history to the Bolsheviks that were led by Vladimir Lenin. They came into power and they overthrew that provisional government that had been set up until this point. The Bolsheviks were very popular. They promised something that was appealing to all of the people. They promised them a time of peace, that they promised them that they could all have a piece of the land. In that feudal system, you don't get your own land. And then they promised them food. So this was a time where they were appealing to the people, and the people were seeing this as an opportunity for them to grab hold of. And so we began to see some of these radical reforms starting to take place. This is when we saw the nationalization of the industry. And then that's going to eventually lead to some of these other political theories that are going to evolve. We began to see them taking the land and redistributing the land, also promising a lot of these people who had not had access to the land, pieces of land. And then that pushes us into the early Soviet era. And the reason that I even mention all of that is to show that this is a region that has had political instability for a very long time. They've been forced under, dictatorships, and they've been forced under, these rules and these governments that they weren't necessarily very fond of. So then when the Bolsheviks came, they consolidated all of that power. They established what we knew then as the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. And that was in 1917. And this was important because it would later become the basis and the foundation of the Soviet Union. But this was the early beginnings in the formation of that Soviet era. Then we had the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922. And that's when the Bolsheviks faced the Red Army, or the Bolshevik Red Army faced the anti-Bolshevik forces, the White Army. And then we began to see intervention coming from the West. So if you remember anything from, maybe you've had European history in high school or in the past, maybe you've taken it in college, it was not as generic as we're making it to here tonight, but this is because we're not focusing on the history. We just want to paint the picture of how we got to where we were at this this war between the Red and the White Army. So the Bolsheviks did emerge from this. They were the victorious side. But the country, because of war, and anytime you have war, you have to have time of reconstruction, a time of rebuilding. There was a lot of devastation. And so the people were suffering because of the war. They were seeing a lot of economic collapse. There was a lot of, fear of, famine and not having enough to provide for their families. So during this time, Lenin implemented what was known as the new economic policy. And this was when we began to see the rise of socialism and a push towards more of the socialist government. But it wasn't really a full, it was more of a retreat from full socialism, but it did allow some elements of private enterprise, which was able to stimulate the economy. And when they did that, it was able to bring them into a time of recovery. So then we move forward to the emergence of Joseph Stalin. And he is the one who came into power after Lenin's death in 1924. His rule marks a time where we see very vicious, very militaristic. His rule was known as the cult of personality. And under the rule of Stalin, there's some discussion, about how Stalin and Putin had very similar personalities, but they didn't necessarily conduct their business in the same way. But Stalin was a very strict, a very difficult and fierce ruler. He initiated the first 5-year plan in 1928. And this was in an attempt to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. One of the things that we see coming from this was the collectivization of agriculture. And so the collectivization means that he is gathering all of these lands that the people had been given previously, and he's taking them under the guise of, this is going to be collectivized for under the government's control, because we're going to use this for the good of all the people. And so collectivizing meant that they were also able to put a lot of effort into improving it and to providing some technology. So it did lead to some economic growth, but at the expense of the people. So this is where we also begin to see, once you become under this type of a rule, you see that it also has a lot of, there are a lot of issues that go along with it. So there were a lot of human suffering, and we'll look at that a little bit later, some of those things that he instituted. We began to see, because of that forced labor, a lot of people were getting sick. We're seeing a lot of health and issues, a lot of deaths occurring. And there was a lot of famine that was going on because of this large scale agriculture. But his regime was characterized by authoritarianism. He also was an oppressor. he operated under a lot of censorship, and he repressed the things that the people were allowed to do, allowed to say, a lot of those freedoms that people had previously. And then there was the Great Purge of the 1930s, and that's where he completely eliminated the political rivals, and millions of these citizens that were perceived as a threat or had an allegiance to other people, and even got rid of his own right-hand man. So the Soviet Union, though, played a really crucial role in World War II. They suffered a lot of casualties, but they really pretty much, some people say they single-handedly won the war. They had the largest amount of casualties, but they had a lot of influence, and ultimately were able to overcome and help overcome Nazi Germany. So then after the war, there was a lot of tension, a lot of political tension that that began to grow, especially in regard to the relationship with the Western countries. And that's what ultimately led up to the Cold War. And then that was a period of what, not necessarily a full-scale war, but more of an ideological war and geopolitical rivalry that would ensue between the Soviet Union and the United States, and some of those Western Bloc countries. And then Stalin died in 1953, which put an end to his era, his cult of personality. But his legacy had a long-lasting impact. So he wasn't necessarily the only one with these ideas, and the only one that had this prescription for how the political sphere and the economic sphere should work. Because of World War II and the Cold War, we began to see this creation of these buffer countries, or these allied communist countries. And Russia, that was a way for them to bring in these buffer countries, because they thought it was a way to protect them from the West, and to protect them from those Western-backed countries of Europe. So this Cold War included things like the arms race, the race to be, to put the first astronaut in space. It was more over a fight over ideas and a fight over political and social agendas than it was necessarily a physical fight. So then during the Cold War, the USSR became a powerful, I don't want to call it a nation, because they weren't all from the same ethnic groups, but it was this collection of people who had been brought in, a collection of countries with a common purpose and a common focus. And so they were able to function together to contribute to a large-scale economy, overseen by a strong, dominant central political system. But then eventually we saw the disintegration and the fall of the USSR. And then because they had, under the USSR, there was this time of move away from socialism into hardline, communism. And there's a very distinct division, and we'll look at that in a second. But then after the fall of the USSR, all of these countries that for a long period of time had been under communist rule, then they were forced into almost overnight free market economies. And they're forced into finding ways to deal with democracy and finding ways to put together a political system, because they were no longer under the protection or under the provisions of the Soviet Union. And so when the Soviet Union fell and the communist group fell apart, it left a lot of these countries in a very serious, a very a very damaging situation in terms of their economy and political systems. Because under Soviet rule, they were told where to work. They were told how to live their life. They were told, communism does away with all religion. They do away with all culture, and everyone has to operate under the same identity. And so they work for a common good, which is usually for the state. They have all of their needs taken care of at the very basic level. And so when they were no longer under those provisions, it left them really struggling and trying to find ways to put together a government and put together some way to run their economy, because they, a lot of them had been involved in industrial jobs and industrial positions, and now they're looking for ways to rebound and to overcome that. So going back a little bit, Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 became this general secretary of the Communist Party. But under Gorbachev's rule, we began to see Gorbachev was leading, his power was leading up to the dissolution of the USSR. But he instituted a couple of policies that were very important. And without those policies being implemented, they may have seen a longer time, a longer period under communist rule. Those two policies were glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, because Gorbachev had relations with the United States, had a very a more open relationship, more understanding than some of the others. And so he actually saw this as a time when he wanted to bring the people, he wanted to bring the people to the forefront. And George Bush, gave a lot of credit to Mikhail Gorbachev, because he said, like, he saw the interest of the people. And, you can see, if you looked at some of these newscasts, you can Google those on YouTube, and find those. And he's praising Gorbachev's efforts, to put the people back into power and to like bring the people back into having some authority. So these two of the ways that he was able to benefit the people, he wanted to, I think he foresaw that this was leading to eventual disaster. And so he said, let's stop, let's take a different avenue. And so glasnost was that policy of open discussion, because under communism, you're not allowed to critique the government. You're not allowed to critique any of these policies or economic activities. And so a lot of people under the former communist rule had been, whole families would be sent to, these labor camps, and they would be just go missing, anytime there was this suspicion of criticizing the government. There would be things that would happen. So he instituted this policy of glasnost, where he encouraged all of the people to have open discussions. And he said, I want to have this transparency where you can come and you can ask questions. You can ask, where did your family members go? You don't have to be afraid of, having some retaliation. And then perestroika was that restructuring of the economy. So he had a program in place where he wanted to redevelop and move away from this industrial system that had been persisting throughout most of communist rule. So first of all, he wanted to open up the transparency, and then he wanted to restructure the economy. When he did this, it did lead to the unraveling of the Soviet system, because with this sort of outward view and this transparency, it gives people the opportunity to look and see where all the problems are, and they begin to ask questions and take a more personal interest into some of these movements and things that are going on. And then in 1991, we did see the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that's when we saw the formation of these 15 independent states. So then that brings us to the rise of Vladimir Putin. He came to power in 1999. Initially, and I used to ask people, who's the president of Russia? And I would get always mixed answers because sometimes he has acted as the prime minister. Sometimes he has acted as the president. And so he initially started, though, as prime minister under Boris Yeltsin. But he succeeded Yeltsin as the president in 2000. And he has since really been like the dominating figure, serving most of the time in both roles as prime minister and as president. So because of that, a lot of people view, I should probably not say anything negative because I'm sure that it's probably listening. But there, a lot of people view Putin as, this sort of totalitarian dictator. But his rule has been complex since 2000. He did bring Russia into a very global economy sphere. He has brought Russia into a lot of issues throughout the years. But he was able to really assert this central power and really bring them to the forefront on the global stage. And so the way that he has accomplished this has been through that authoritarian policies. His economic policies have been criticized, but somewhat effective. But he also has had a lot of issues with things like human rights abuse, suppression of political dissent. He has had a hand in a lot of foreign interest in foreign affairs. And then we know that currently there is the issue with Ukraine and several other militaristic opportunities that Russia has been involved in through a period of time. So one of the things that it's important for us to talk about, because this is where we see the rise of communism and the rise of these centrally planned economies, also known as a command economy. You might see it both ways, depending on what you're reading. But a centrally planned economy is that where the government owns all of the land. They make all of the decisions. They control all of the land, and they also own all of the means of production. So if the government owns everything and they also own the means of production, that means it's kind of like a monopoly and they own everything. So they dictate all of the things that happen under this type of an economy. So this is where we begin to see the mixing of the political sphere into the economic, sector. So we're seeing the government controlling all of the economy, where, for it to be, productive, you usually would see a separation of the economy and the political system. But this is where the government is saying, okay, we're in control. We have all of the things. They control and they dictate and they direct all of the labor, all of the activities in the economy, from producing the clothes, the shoes, all the textiles, they own all of the natural resources. They own all the factories. They distribute the jobs to the people. So you might have people given jobs that have no formal training, and that can lead to having things like, there have been instances where they've had factories producing all left shoes, and no right shoes to go with it, because there was no one in charge that was strategically, directing these activities. And that has had an impact on the economy, until recent times. So under this centrally planned economy, there have been, some successes, but there have also been a lot of failures that we see. Stalin's most destructive powers were the secret police, who had lots of different secret police around. He would, yes. Mm-hmm. That is a a very loaded question. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about that. The secret police, though, I think under Stalin's command were more or less mercenaries, or more aligned to that type of a figure. They were sent for very specific purposes, not necessarily there to protect and defend, but to serve the interest of the government. And so they carried out a lot of initiatives that were directed by a corrupt government. They got rid of a lot of people, and a lot of people that were considered suspicious. So that's the best way I can explain, or describe the role of these secret police. There were also these mass executions. We still may not have seen it, but we've heard a lot of issues in the last 10 or so years of things like this happening in North Korea, which is still under a totalitarian communist rule. The secret police, how they function was very similar to that was under Stalin. There's a lot of starvation because the government also owns all the food. They own all the food production, all the food inventory. And then there are these gulags, which are labor camps. And they're concentration labor camps where people are forced to go. So a lot of people that were in direct opposition to Stalin's government would be sent to the gulags, and then a lot of them never seen or heard from again. And that was one of the things that Gorbachev was wanting to do in that glasnost, was that, because people couldn't ask about their relatives that went missing. If they were sent to these gulags and never seen again, they just had to not know. And that was one of those things that Gorbachev was trying to address, and to bring people out of this time of fear and a lot of anxiety and a lot of really harsh conditions. So but that they were instituted under the rule of Stalin. So for us, though, to think about some of these issues, because in the United States we don't have this type of a government, and unless you have lived in a government where you've been under communism or socialism, sometimes it's hard for us coming from a democracy, to understand what is intended, and like what makes up the different philosophies. So to kind of help bring some understanding, because I also hear, especially on social media, it is very very common to hear people interchangeably use the term communism and socialism. If I were to, maybe an interesting activity would be to poll everyone before class and say, okay, tell me what is communism and what is socialism? And I bet we would get some very different answers. But communism, communism is developed from some of that original ideology, original philosophy that socialism was founded on. But the philosophy behind communism says, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. There's free access to the articles of consumption that are made possible by advances in technology that allow for superabundance. But if we compare that to, the philosophy behind socialism, it's still from each according to his ability, to each according to his contribution. So instead of the idea that everyone is going to put in an effort, but under socialism, what you contribute directly reflects what you can get from society, or what you can get from this system. But under communism, everyone is going to get just the very basic needs met according to their ability, but everyone will at least get their basic needs met. Under socialism, there's an emphasis on profit, and that distribution of the wealth among society. And also it allows for wages and salaries, which gives the room for upward mobility. So under communism, it's pretty much everyone will benefit from the same technology, and they will get the same thing regardless. So it's going to kind of a flat, even field. There's no upward movement, and everyone is just going to be given the same sort of base everything. But that is not what we see in the philosophy of socialism. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Has anybody read the Communist Manifesto? It's a great book. Karl Marx had a lot of great ideas that have worked and been the foundation for a lot of different, governments and put into practice. But when it's practiced on large scale communist philosophy, is when you get into the issues and the difficulties and the struggles. But the idea that they came up with originally was about benefiting all the people and giving them the opportunity to have some room for movement, some room to grow. And that was really the foundation of that original philosophy from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. But some of the ideas in communism, are that all people are the same, and that it makes no sense to have social classes. So, for someone who is coming, you wonder, how did they gain support originally? Well, if you're coming from a feudal society and you've had all of these times throughout history where you have been under the rule of someone else and who was not necessarily from your own cultural or ethnic group, and you've been forced into a lower social order, the idea that you do away with all social class is kind of appealing. And so, that was one of the founding ideas under communism, was that all people are going to be put on this level, even field. And so, like, no one would be in a social order higher than the other unless you're in the government. But that wasn't what was promoted. And another idea was that the government should own all of the land and all of the means of the production, and they should own everything else too. That the people, in essence, should work, and they should work hard for the government. And the collective output, so like everyone should come together and work together, but then the government is going to take that hard work and they're going to redistribute it to all of the people equally. So there's never a time for, you know, anyone to get more than someone else. And that goes back to that philosophy. So, and then under socialism, it's all individuals should have access to the basic articles of consumption and public goods to allow them to have self-actualization. Large-scale industries are a collective effort, and the returns that you get from those industries should benefit the society as a whole. Not necessarily that the government should dictate out all of who gets those benefits, but that the people have some sort of freedom of choice, and the people have the opportunity to redistribute that wealth themselves. The government is there, but kind of as an not as a controller, but more as like an overseer or a supervisor that keeps things running. So those are some of the basic foundational differences. Under some of the things that happen under communism is we see these centrally planned governments. We see a centrally planned economy. There usually will be a dictator that is over the proletariat. You know, there's going to be government ownership of all of the means of production, meaning the tools. They own all of the everything that goes into society that they own. But like we said, socialism allows for the people to have a say, and the people are able to take that wealth and to grow it and produce with more independence. A communist society is stateless and classless. It is governed directly by the people, but we don't see it playing out that way in actuality and in reality. What we see is these people rising to power and then controlling, and that's where we see like you know, Stalin coming into power. But under a socialist political system, it can coexist with different political systems. And we talked last week about some of those social welfare systems. And that is how this has played out in reality. But most socialists advocate a participatory democracy. So if you like, Bernie Sanders was a big proponent of a social democracy. Or there's also things like a parliamentary democracy. You know, this sense of democratic centralism. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so anything that you would pay, especially if you're paying taxes, you know, to certain things that go to provide benefits, Social Security, um, benefits for, you know, those with, you know, disabled persons, those kinds of things. We also, it depends, you know, it can be funded different ways. And, you know, if we're looking at that, we are not going to see socialism on a large scale in the United States, though, because even with that social kind of governance and redistributing those taxes, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of things that prevent that from being what socialism intends ideally. But yes, that's correct. Some of these political movements, Leninism was one of those early forms, Stalinism, Marxism, and then under socialism, democratic socialism, libertarian. If you've paid much attention to the Libertarian Party in the United States, there was a very powerful political presidential candidate in the last election who was a libertarian. There's also social anarchism, There's lots of different types of political movements that have been founded under the philosophy of socialism. But under one of the most important things is under communism, all forms of private property do not exist. You are not allowed to own anything privately. Everything is shared. Everything is collectively used and distributed. And under, sorry, I gotta figure out how to make that go away. Under socialism, we have two kinds of property. You have personal property, and then you have public property. Your personal property, things that you can own. You're allowed to own homes and clothes and cars, those kinds of things. But public property includes the means of production. Those are going to be the things like factories, and those kinds of things. So does that help? Does that make the issue or the idea between communism and socialism, does it make it easier to understand, or do you still have questions or discussions? But this has really been, it's important for us to talk about and understand, because this has really led to a long history and still is causing issues today in modern day Russia and those other republics that were formed. And then we're going to see it again when we talk about East Asia. So this former command economy, it successfully, and like I said, it was really one of the things that made it popular, not really popular, but made it come into being, was that it successfully was able to eradicate abject poverty. Pretty much everyone had their basic needs met. So there was no real large scale serious poverty. That does not mean that anybody was wealthy or that anyone had enough, just that everyone avoided the very most difficult, horrible forms of poverty. So everyone had a place to live. We'll call it a house. Had a place to live. They had a way to work and to have their needs met. But when you have some of the things that showed that this was not a great system, was because under the former command economy, we began to see a lot of things like inefficiencies, scarcities, and gluts. If you had economics, you might remember about the whole issue of supply and demand. One affects the other. If you have too much of a supply, then the demand goes down. But if you have not enough of a supply, the demand goes up. And so there's this, under this type of a command economy, there's never really a demand because the government controls all of the means of the production. It's not designed to meet your needs. It's designed to meet your needs. It's not designed to meet your wants. So there's no competition. And for an economy to really thrive and to grow, you need competition. And so it becomes very evident that this is a very inefficient method of production. Like I said, there were factories that were producing, 2 left shoes instead of a left and a right shoe. And I believe there are still some videos that you can watch that show some of these issues coming out of the factories. They were producing more of one part of a car than another. They had too many hoods and they didn't have any bumpers, or they had too many bumpers and not enough doors. So it was really becoming an issue. And that's where, when the fall of the Soviet rule and the move away from this hardline communism, it left them in a lot of dire straits, because they had never been taught how to supervise or manage or run logistically, plan for an economy or for even at, production at one of these factories. If there's no competition and there's no chance of getting a wage increase, there's also going to be no motivation. So there's really no one that's trying to work hard. So everyone's just doing the very bare minimum. You're going to see that, there's no quality. You're going to see a lot of times the prices are overpriced, or maybe there's a shortage. There's not enough of these things that are being produced. And then it also, if there's no competition, you're going to see a lack of technological innovation. Except for those things that the government had a vested interest in during the Cold War. Those were things like, investing in their military, investing in space exploration, and then very quickly, though, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we began to see that their technology declined, and still today is suffering because of that lack of innovation and desire for innovation, because of no competition. A lot of times the ones who were receiving any kind of a reward were those that had ties to the Communist Party or had some relationship to those that were in control. But if now moving on to look at how we, some of these reform movements that began to happen in the post-Soviet era, one of those was privatization or marketization. That's where, the government, and this, like I said, it happened almost overnight, where the government was turning control over to some of these factories and to some of these industries, and they were selling them or distributing them to private companies or individuals who had amassed enough of money to purchase those. So for overnight, it went from 0 to 70% private control of what had formerly been controlled by the government. It intended to maximize the efficiency because it was giving the control back to the people. But it was very difficult, because they didn't have the government putting price controls in place. There were, no one was there to control how much things cost. There was no one there to say, okay, you need this much of this product. And so we began to see, they're experiencing supply and demand for the first time. And that led to an initial scarcity. And when you have a scarcity, you don't have enough of certain products, and it causes the price of those to go really high. And it can cause inflation and lots of other serious issues. The raw materials were some of the first things to become privatized. And that, if we were to compare that to in American history, when we began to see the rise of industry, we saw these oligarchs or these people who had wealth and money getting control of lots and lots of things. And we begin to see the same things happening here as well. These oligarchs controlling, people with the money getting control of lots of these different parts of, production. And they came to be known as robber barons. We also had robber barons was a term that was used throughout American history for the early people like the Standard Oil, Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company, Andrew Carnegie and the steel industry. It could be compared to that type of an environment. They would gather as much as they could and hold on to that, and then become very powerful because of that. And so instead of the money going to fund the social programs, we saw a lot of that money going back into, to the people that had been able to purchase some of the industries. We also saw, and still today, a growing informal economy. And remember, if you have a very large informal economy compared to your formal economy, what kinds of things happen? No taxes, that are going in to fund these social welfare programs. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they and if you have an informal economy, like no one's regulating it either. So pretty much people are just trying to live, so we see a lot of subsistence, agriculture. So not necessarily, innovations, spurring technology improvement, but people reverting back to agricultural means, like these street open air markets, means where people are just trying to sell products that they can create. And then again, no one's regulating it. So no one is, there to put any kind of regulations in place. So the prices are just whatever people charge, and then so that it creates a lot of issues in itself. So we see the rise of the black market, we see a lot of corruption starting to happen. And a revert back to some of the ways of the early communist era. And so it also begins to, once it becomes so large, it really begins to skew the economic statistics. So if we looked at the GDP or the GNP or the Gini coefficient of, Russia, it's not going to be as telling as what their actual economic production and, their means are. Because you don't have anyone taking statistics on the informal market. Because they're not collecting taxes, and it's not going back to be put back into infrastructure. So tax-free does not benefit the entire country. A lot of people want to, especially you hear a lot of people say, oh, we need lower taxes or lower, we need to pay less in taxes. But if run efficiently, your taxes could be put to use to provide for the people. But if no one is paying taxes, then you have a serious problem. Mm-hmm. That is an ongoing social issue and debate. That's we could probably talk for an year about political corruption. But it goes back to talking about the. Hmm?
Not necessarily think and money, of course. We are
But are we collectively a unified? I'm saying we're talking now about the United States. Are we collectively a unified people? I mean, are we a unified nation? The discussion, I mean, those are good questions.
So I'd say it's more regional,
But even well, I mean, going back to like the Civil War, I mean, like even within, in the South, are all people in this that are considered Southerners, are they of a collective culture or a mindset, or do they have a common interests, and we have to say no.
Your regional identity and your political differences, your economic differences make it difficult for us to say we're one thing as a nation. Right? But the very second North Korea points, a ballistic missile at Kansas City, we become one nation again. So there is a unifying underlying reason why we're still a country. We fight, we disagree, but our structure works better than any one of those. So
Yeah.
It's the only thing I don't understand is how small differences between Southern and more broadly American has anything to do with sending money to like Ukraine or Israel or,
Worry about ourselves first. We're sending money to war efforts.
yeah, and there's plenty of home we could be spending money on. But our economy depends on the global economy being stable.
We do.
Our safety, well, if Russia is able to completely run over Ukraine without stopping, where do they stop next? How about London? How about Paris? How about all the other, members of the United Nations? I mean, how much closer do they need to come to the United States before we make it? They just go take over somebody's country. We have
a priority protection to a point, but to the point where it's like interfering with our own national interests is when it's a problem.
That's true, but we're also not, it's not a blank check either, it's also highly contested in Congress right now. It's not, there's a lot of, debate about how much we should be giving, whether we should be giving more or not. And that's because we have a whole bunch of different voices in the country, and those voices are represented in Congress. As bad a job as I think Congress does most of the time, it's what you're saying is true. Somebody in Congress is saying, why are we spending money there instead of there? And everybody's trying to get it right.
I feel like it's important to have discussions. Because it's really not just a right issue.
None of it is. None of it is.
Really.
Except that at the end of the day, we don't want to be Congress.
Right.
It's like,
I'm sure it would be nice.
Well, that's one of those things the UN is struggling with, like, are they supporting all of the weight for all of the countries trying to get into the United Nations?
the United Nations, well, we're still the heavy hitter for the United Nations. And what we get is stability. What we get is some greater voice and greater control over how that unifying body responds to a terrorist group.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're buying a larger table at larger seat at the table in those global security issues, those global economic issues. So it's
Yeah.
Large trade routes.
Well, and I think on a global scale, the economy has a lot of sway, even if it's not openly evident, to all people. But I think the economy is a big factor. And so I mean, we could spend a lot of time looking at, we have some similarities for the United States and in the region we're talking about now. But then we have a lot of dissimilarities. But it's important though to understand that these are the issues that are not just facing, one country. Like it's not just the United States that's facing this. This is, and we're seeing this large scale happening, in this trying to rebuild and put back together Russia. And, whether we're not going to spend time tonight, we could debate about, the Ukraine issue or Crimea or any of those things that they have illegally done, over the last, 20 years. But, like it's, do it. Well, I mean, I guess it depends on whose perspective yeah. No, that's not, I'm not saying that I'm saying it's illegal. I'm saying like we could debate it, you know, like. No.
Oftentimes I'll hear people say, if they don't think that the whole Ukraine thing is justified from the perspective of Russia, they try to cause those people to vote to be part of Russia, or those people to consider themselves as
Mhm.
Russia. So,
Yeah,
part of the challenge is all of those outlying countries, they're not 100% for or against rejoining Russia. There's an internal conflict in each of those regions.
yeah.
And
Mm-hmm. That's right. And there are, if you're interested, and I'm not trying to like push geography, the geography agenda, but like there are regional studies. So if you are like Latin America, if you're interested, you know, like in just spending a lot of time on one specific region, there are regional studies that spend the whole semester just talking about that region. And those can be very, very interesting courses. So just throwing that out there if you're ever interested. I don't teach any of those here, but we have some really good ones. But we'll try to move on. I didn't mean to spend this much time, but it's important because, like you said, like these are discussions that that would need to happen. And please don't ever misunderstand anything that I say up here. I'm not giving you my own personal perspective or opinion. I am giving you from an outside opinion. So like you'll never leave the classroom and be like, oh yeah, she stands for this, or these are her beliefs or views, but because I'm never going to tell you what those are in class. I'm giving all the information is coming to you from a unbiased perspective. I'm just giving you the information. So, I mean, except for Putin, I guess, maybe I am biased against Putin. Anyway, no, though, we do want to look quickly, not we'll spend as much time on the population, but it's very, very telling for us to look at the population in this area. So we're going to see they have a lot of people living in very small spaces. You can see by this map where we see the largest concentrations of the population. Sparsely populated areas are going to be where we find along the Trans-Siberian Railroad, that frozen tundra and taiga area. We're going to see fewer people living there. But we're going to see that they are concentrated in very few specific cities. And along that, we're going to also find them living close to those industrial and mining areas. But with the change, we want to look at how it has happened over time in regard, especially to like the USSR. Under the USSR, we said there was kind of this relatively high standard of living and well-being, just because everyone was getting their basic needs met, not necessarily a high standard of living, but they were living. But then in post 1991, we see, you would think we're going to see this improvement, but then we see this rapidly deteriorating population. And so we see actually a decline in the life expectancy, especially in the male population. So if we looked at this, you can see from 1990 over to 2018, you can see the change in the population. So this is the total population, and this is the labor force. So if we look just for a minute, how it changed, you can see there's a dip here in the labor force. And then we begin to see a little bit of an increase, but then it starts to fall. And so if you have a declining population and you have a declining labor force, what does that mean? When we were looking at how development happens through the demographic transition, it's very telling if we looked at those population pyramids and they have an inverted shape, it means they can't support their population. And eventually they're going to have a crisis where they're not replacing the population, and you don't have enough people in the workforce to provide for the aging population, or for the young people. And so some of these things can directly be attributed to alcoholism. Have the highest rates of alcoholism in the world. A lot of nutritional deficiencies that are causing some of these decline in life expectancy. Also, there's a lot of stress, physical and mental. They have gone through a long history of war and fighting and conflict, and so there's a lot of stress from trying to find jobs. And then we also see that a lot of women are now getting into the workforce and are choosing not to have children, so that contributes to lower birth rates. But then if we looked at these population pyramids, not every state or every nation in this region is the same. We could look at, this is Kazakhstan in 2023, and this is the Russian Federation. And we can see a very big difference. So right away, we see that Kazakhstan is still in a developing stage. Maybe they're still in stage 3 of the demographic transition. They have they're having a lot of babies being born, but then they have something happen here where there was a decline in the population for a period of 10 years. And then we have another baby boom, and then we have a decline. So we could compare that to Russia, and they look different, but both of them are indicative of serious issues that are facing the people, the economy. And so you have to think about what are you going to do to resolve these issues. And so those are some of the things that they're still struggling with. We'll skip. We already talked about some of this. There was, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we began to see more people taking an active role in political issues. But then we also began to see a rise in that cultural and religious revival as well. So like we started out saying that Christianity, they adopted as a whole, very largely Christianity, and that's how they functioned and operated for a long period of time until communism, when communism said there's no religion allowed. Communism, the government is your religion. And then after the fall of the USSR and that move away from communism, then we began to see these religious revivals happening, and more people, they didn't, not necessarily were they not practicing their religions, but they were doing it more so in secrecy and not out in open public. But then we began to see a move towards more people participating in religious activities. In terms of the social reform, somebody has to tell me how to get that off of there. So when we think about the political reforms as well, democracy has been relatively slow in terms of how it has developed in the area. Some of the countries adopted democracy, some have not, and some have embraced it more efficiently and effectively than others. Belarus, Russia, Central Asia have an issue with their legislatures. They're well known for being rubber stamps. There are also these oligarchs and these politicians who come in and get control and have a lot of power. And one of the things though that we see is that a lot of the older people are more likely to vote for socialist or authoritarians, because that's just the mindset, and it's hard to break free from that after it's been a cycle for so long. But then the younger populations are the ones who are getting more active, and they're voting and more likely to vote for these reformist policies and politicians. But one of the things that keeps them sort of still oppressed is that there's this lack of free press in Russia. So when I was jokingly said, I don't want to say anything because Putin might be listening, because there's still people that are still being oppressed in Russia. So they're not free to publish things as they would in a more open country. The government has been known for many, many times murdering journalists, murdering people who come out in opposition of the government. And so it can be a very dangerous situation for anyone to come out and be supportive or critical, supportive of reform, but critical of the government or those who are in power. This cultural revival, you can see one of the examples is this Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. It was burned and destroyed. This was the original building. And then under communist rule, it was not allowed to be rebuilt. I think there were a couple of attempts at rebuilding it, and they were burned each time. And then this is what it looks like today. So you can see there's been some an increase in this religious activity. Now today we have largely Orthodoxy is the largest practiced religion. There are a lot of evangelical Protestants now that we see moving and taking missionary type roles into this region. So we do see a rise and an improvement in the religious agenda. And in terms of gender and opportunity, in today, Russia has a free market, somewhat of a free market. But by the 1970s, 90% of the women were working outside the home. And just like we talked about last week, they were experiencing this concept of double day, where they would work outside the home, but then they come back and they're expected to meet the gender societal norms of working inside the home domestically as well. But now we have women that are becoming more educated. Even more so, we have the data shows that more women are getting higher degrees and achieving degrees more than the men. But there's still an unequal distribution in terms of like the power that they have. So there's a lack of supervisory jobs. Often there will be lower pay for the same positions for males and females. And then there's just open discrimination as well that we see rampantly in these job ads. And so you might see a job ad that says no women with children are allowed to apply, or if they find out that women have applied for the job, they may be discriminated against if they have, or if they're of childbearing age, or if they have children, because there's this 3-year paid maternity leave that the government offers up to 3 years. And so there's a lot of employers who are fearful of hiring women because if they're in childbearing age, they may be forced to deal with the long time of leave. So a lot of issues still go into this. Yes. Oh, we are not required to have any maternity leave in the US.
Okay,
Paid. It's up to the individual company. They make their own policies. Well, they usually will give you 6 weeks. Most of the time it's going to be unpaid, or you can choose to do like short-term disability and file for disability. But a lot of companies, especially smaller companies, don't offer paid maternity leave.
I don't understand why we think that we should have a maternity. I'm shocked that a country that doesn't want to take care of its citizens otherwise will give 3 years of paid leave to have a kid.
Oh, yeah.
I don't. And he's genuinely surprised that we don't have minimum paid and maternity leave.
But I don't know how much it costs.
They don't have one if you can't afford it.
I mean, of course not, but it costs like thousands of dollars out when you're out of a job, your partner, assuming that you're in a nuclear family, you're gonna be on a 1% income. So unfortunately, this day and age, it's not the same. Raising a child is so much more expensive that you really do need that money. To the point where it's almost impossible without it. There are mothers that have to go to food banks, that have to go to churches to get diapers for their babies, because they're simply unable to afford it, because they don't have kids. If you're not, and especially for people that have been loyal to companies, I don't think that you should get paid leave from companies. I don't think you should get paid leave from certain like low level, but I think that if you're loyal to a company for like 5-10 years, I believe you deserve at least 6 months to take leave, have a baby.
I think you make a great argument. I've just never been able to get on board with that. And I have a child, and I had to pay for my home, for, you know, my medical care, my time off of work. I just don't,
I just think that.
I've never been able to get, I've never been able to figure out why I don't know, I don't connect with that idea at all.
It's like a human part of it. Look outside.
Yes, go ahead. Oh, hold on. She has a question. She had her hands up.
But I'm curious, in countries where there are more, where there's more government like support of maternity leave or even maternity leave,
Mhm.
whichever case, is the population more stable, or does it like increase or decrease more?
Well, it depends, because like we could do we could do like an case study analysis. If it depends on where you are, because if you're looking at places like Finland, that offer like they have high 70% taxes, that go to pay for these social welfare programs, but because they're one of those social democracies. But then that, they get a lot of benefits that are provided. So they do get both maternity and paternity leave, but they also get a lot of other things provided by the government. But then we could look at other places where there is very, very limited social welfare program in place, and they don't. So like, I mean, it's comparing.
How is it, like the work for like population demographic?
Mhm.
I was just curious, like in countries, like is there anything that countries do to kind of like boost childbirth? Like if
Yes.
their population is decreasing to the point where it's like a really big issue, like what do they do?
We'll actually are going to address that when we talk about Southeast Asia, because they have like put out these campaigns to encourage their people to hook up.
That's what I was trying to ask about accident.
Yeah.
More individualized. It's harder to find community and people where like neighborhood where you can hang out and send the kids over to somebody's house. We live farther away from our parents now, so I feel like maybe one of the issues with maternity leave being seen as such a big thing is it's harder to raise a child when you don't have connections. So a lot of people don't have those connections yet. That might be why our needs tend to be more towards supporting maternity. But I can totally see how like there's different generational aspects to raising children.
Well, and too, I mean, like, I mean, we could, this will be a great topic, by the way, for anybody to want to do a presentation on. Yeah. So, are you familiar with like, so like, are you saying you're kind of surprised by it because you have in your country, they have social systems in place to support that? Oh, so I'm sorry, here. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, personally, I think it leaves like out just like the happiness or just
Mm.
goes against like the joy of becoming a parent. Like, just like as how it is described, it really sounds like very difficult, not only because economically, but also just like you cannot raise your own child, you cannot be present to them, you have to like go and send it to a daycare if they want. And it leaves out the aspect of maternity. I mean, I think, I don't know, just even, how do you call it? How do you call it? Even breastfeeding, like I imagine that even becoming difficult. Like it just sounds like very sad, and that's where personally, sorry if it's offensive for Americans, but that's where I think there should be a limit drawn, like an economy that is 101% efficient to like consume a little more like the human aspect of life.
So you're saying instead of focusing solely on the also focus on different aspects of society as well.
No, I'm not saying that all of that is left out. I'm just saying this one little aspect, that, you know, becoming, having a child should be like this.
That makes sense.
Not even like instant, like, to encourage people to have more children or anything, but you know, at least having 1, 2, or 3 months, like, you know, bring the child to like, enjoy being a mother, and even also for the father. That's something that personally for me looks a little scary when thinking about staying with your child. Yeah.
So now I'm really, really wishing that I had done this whole North America unit. Yeah, we may have to work that in there. Somebody can definitely address that in your research topics if you want. But let's try to fit. Oh yeah, one more. Sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean,
But yeah, and there are companies that do provide both maternity and paternity leave. I mean, my son-in-law was able, yeah,
That is a benefit. It's a very valuable, very popular benefit. It's not like it's non-existent here.
oh, yeah.
I just spoke up my own 2 cents worth, and I'm not offended at your opinion, and I think you're right. That the opportunity to bond with your child and have that maternal experience is very important. I don't mean to minimize that. That's not, I mean, I'm a mother, and I was lucky enough to be able to stay home with my child and have a father who was in the picture, who stayed home after I went back to work, so that she always had a parent. We prioritize that over other financial choices.
Right.
And so I don't just mean to diminish it at all. I just, on a political level, I have issues with having us have to all pay for it. But that's my own thing. That doesn't mean that I don't value the human experience. So, and this is just, everybody's.
yeah, and that's a good point. Like it's not, yeah, there is this discussion and you'll see that. So there are people that support it. There's just not, that may not believe it should be federally mandated or paid for. So, but let's move on real quick. So we've talked about this instability and corruption. This is still something we see very largely in both the government, the political, and the economy. And then environmental issues. This is the longest we've ever gone in class. But so just real quick, let's hit on a couple of these environmental issues, because this region has some of the most serious environmental degradation that has happened in terms of the environment. Because we see that mindset under communism, it believes it's very similar to capitalism, if you were to compare the two, that believe that nature is kind of a servant to industry. And that's what we talked about with the mercantilism, and that rise of the age of exploration, that idea that you're the environment sometimes takes a back seat into when industry and the economy is involved. So because of that, today there's really a lack of desire, and there's a lack of money that's available to to deal with these environmental issues. So some of they've had some of the most serious issues in terms of environment, which are, I'm going to skip over, because of that industrial pollution. There's a lot of air pollution. There's a lot of water pollution, and without the infrastructure and without that money that's going into to pay for the correction that you need to fix these things, pollution is kind of one of those issues that stays and remains very serious. Also, it has the world's worst nuclear pollution. There have been over 500 nuclear explosions in Kazakhstan that still today contribute to birth defects. Chernobyl was one of the worst global issues. In 1986 is when the nuclear reactor melted down. 5,000 people died, so it wasn't like an immediate explosion and it killed a bunch of people. It was the long lasting and long term effects that have had the most devastating impacts. 300 or 30,000 people were disabled because of this accident. All of the people were ultimately evacuated from this area. And now it remains, even to today, you can't live there. I think the longest you can stay there is like 15 minutes. You have to be with a guide. You have to be in full hazmat. You have to be tested for radiation. So it's still not a place that you'll likely in our lifetimes will ever be able to go back to. But it was very devastating. And this is not just one incident. Like this type of situation has happened many times. Yes. Yeah, and there's this, I read, if you're interested, research the dogs of Chernobyl. Because German Shepherds, there's this ongoing research study where German Shepherds are the only dogs who have remained in the area, and they continue to populate for some reason. Yeah.
Somewhat resistant to radiation that hasn't been studied yet, identified
It is, and it's very interesting. So if you're interested, write that down, German Shepherds in Chernobyl. But they're also, because of the large military, expenditures, they've had a lot of nuclear testing in these nuclear bases. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it's just and it takes so long to clean that kind of pollution up. In these places where they were testing, radiation on their own, or, these nuclear explosions on their own soil, it's 20 times the radiation that we find in Chernobyl. So lots and lots of the area that was had issues because of that. I'm going to put the rest of this on Canvas so you guys can, I'm not going to keep you any longer. But make sure that you do read about the RLC and how it shrunk, and it's still an issue today. And then that's pretty much it. Just the rest of these are talking about specific countries. So next week, we decided that we are going to work out of class on our projects. Right? So, okay. If you need me, I will be available. So reach out and let me know. I can meet with you. I can meet, if you need me to come up here, I will. Just let me know. All right. Okay. Well, we all have a wonderful evening and rest of your week. Thanks for the discussion. It's so boring when nobody talks. Have a good week.
Good night.